Your hand and
just get my touch.
Show people the way. There are a few, so it's really wonderful. Here's your pen. To see so many of you here. It's so wonderful, in fact, that I really need to take a picture. So smile.
Is this a selfie or a...
Thank you.
Turn around.
So, welcome, and if this is your first time in the new NAASR Vartan Gregorian building, welcome to NAASR, welcome back to NAASR, or welcome to NAASR for the first time, as the case may be. This is our third or fourth event here in the new building, and I think we're really starting to get good at this, so thanks for joining us. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Takayan Cultural Association of Greater Boston and the NAASR Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation lecture series on contemporary Armenian issues. I want to thank the Takayan for joining with us tonight, of course, and I thank the Gulbenkian Foundation for their continuing support of our programs on contemporary topics. And this is a contemporary topic. Ani may have been a medieval capital of Armenia, and the book under discussion may have been written and originally published over a century ago, but the meaning of Ani and its fate are very much, indeed, contemporary Armenian issues. We have many upcoming events here, both locally in this building and elsewhere and around the country. I won't keep you all night by listing them all, but I want to mention a couple. A full list is available on the front table there if you're interested.
There's also a chair here.
As well as a chair, which I don't recommend. And Laura will be very unhappy because she'll be using it later to sell books. But we certainly invite you to be on our email list or follow us on various modes of social media in order to keep abreast of all the NAASR activities. But next week at Harvard University on Thursday night, we would invite you to join us for a panel discussion entitled Bilingualism, Learning and Living in Multiple Worlds, which will feature Dr. Lisa Gulasarian, Dr. Vartan Matiosian, Dr. Maria Luisa Paravelasco, and with the moderation of Dr. Anna Ohania. And it will consider issues of bilingual education, bilingual upbringing, and the value and challenges of existing in a bilingual world. On Wednesday, March 18th, here in this room, we'll be joining with the Armenia Tree Project to present a panel discussion entitled Green Revolution, Armenia's Vision to Fight Global Climate Change. And that, again, indeed, a very contemporary Armenian as well as world issue, which I hope you will be here to join in the discussion. So, back to tonight. Our speakers tonight are Peter Balakian and Aram Arkun, who served as editor and translator, respectively, of The Ruins of Ani, published by Rutgers University Press, and written by Peter's great-great-uncle, Bishop Gregor Balakian. And it was first published in Armenian in Constantinople in 1910, a book which I'm very happy to say we have in our library downstairs.
And for sale.
And yeah, I might mention that this version is for sale. The library copy, not so much. But we would urge you to pick up a copy of the book after the lecture. And of course, Peter and Aram would be, I think, only too happy to sign your copy. You can do that right up here at the end of the program. It's a happy coincidence that tonight's program follows hard on the heels of NAASR's announcement just a couple of weeks ago of the winners of our 2019 Dr. Sona Aronian Book Prizes for Excellence in Armenian Studies. NAASR's Aronian Prizes were established in 2014 by the late Dr. Sona Aronian and Dr. Jeffrey Gibbs, and they are awarded annually to outstanding scholarly works in the English language in the field of Armenian studies and to translations from Armenian into English. In the former category, scholarly works in the English language, the co-winners for 2019 were Professor Tamar Boyagin's The City Lament, Jerusalem Across the Medieval Mediterranean, published by Cornell University Press, and Professor Jennifer Dixon for Dark Pasts, Changing the State's Story in Turkey and Japan, also Cornell University Press. It was a good year for Cornell University Press. And in the translation category, the winners are tonight's speakers, Peter Balakian and Aram Arkun, for their work, The Ruins of Ani. So that deserves applause. Needless to say, I think anyway, it's tremendously important to make available works of Armenian literature, historiography, memoirs, and other works to non-Armenian language speakers and readers. Of course, there's great importance in being able to access materials in their original language, but it's also equally important, perhaps, to make them accessible to the wider world, which may not have access through fluency in the Armenian language. So they've done a really wonderful thing in making this book available to a wider readership, and I think imbuing it with a currency that we will hear about tonight. So it's my happy responsibility to introduce Peter Balakian, who will be the second speaker tonight, but I'm going to introduce him now. Dr. Peter Balakian is the Donald M. and Constance H. Rebar Professor of the Humanities in the Department of English at Concord University. He is the author of numerous books, including The Burning Tigris, The Armenian Genocide and America's Response, which won the Raphael Lemkin Prize, Black Dog of Fate, which was the winner of the Penn Albrand Award for Memoir, the essay collection Vice and Shadow, essays on the lyric imagination, poetry, art, and culture, and numerous books of poetry, including Ozone Journal, for which he won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. He has been involved as co-translator and editor of the English language editions of Siamanto's Garmir Lurer Parigamis, Bloody News from My Friend, and of Bishop Balakian's memoir, Armenian Golgotha. And Peter has, for decades, been an active and eloquent spokesman for human rights, for justice for the Armenian people and for all peoples, for historical truth and against denial, and dare I say, as a passionate advocate for the power of art and literature to elevate the human spirit. It's my pleasure now to welcome Aida Yavshayan, who is the chair of the Greater Boston Takayan Cultural Association chapter, who will say a few words on behalf of Takayan and introduce our first speaker, Aram Arkun. Aida.
On behalf of Takayan Cultural Association of Greater Boston Chapter, good evening to all. I would like to announce two of our upcoming events with Takayan Cultural Association this year. The first one is on April 3rd. We're gonna have an Easter dessert demonstration featuring Chef Nathan Kibarian. This is going to be on April 3rd, as I told you, at 7 p.m. In our Baikar building. The second event that we have will be VEM Ensemble. After popular demand, after last year's performance of them at Holy Trinity Church. So we are having them again this year on May 3rd, Sunday afternoon, right after church hours in Holy Trinity Church. This is an ensemble of the UCLA Music School under direction of music director Movses Bogosian. So those are the two events that I would like to share with you this evening. And now I would like to invite Aram Arkun, the executive director of Takayan of USA and Canada, and assistant editor at the Armenian Mirror Spectator. As an historian in Armenian studies, he will offer his expertise on Ani and the book called Ruins of Ani. Thank you.
first of all, I'd like to say how pleased and thankful I am for this unexpected Aronian Prize. I think that it's important to encourage more translation as well as scholarship on Armenian topics. And scholarship is somewhat, it's difficult enough, but translation is even less rewarding in many ways, and so it's important for us who want to make our classical and new works of Armenian history and culture accessible to encourage that, and there are very few people. I'm not doing very much of it. This is just like a one-off thing, but we should try to encourage more people to do that. So thank you very much, NAASR, and also it's wonderful again to be in this renovated building, and it seems like you're on a roll with a huge crowd. Anyhow, I am a historian, but I'm not a specialist in medieval period. I translated this and I annotated this, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the significance of Ani and the book, and I believe Peter will continue with talking more about the modern implications. So Ani has a special place in Armenian history, and in modern times has a special resonance as a symbol of Armenian culture. And it's basically almost a mystical land of 1,001 churches. So the significance of Ani became more and more important in the 19th century in the Armenian Renaissance. Before, by the 18th century, it became a relatively deserted area with almost no settled population. But in the 19th century, travelers started to visit, and they remarked on this unusual situation where there's a relatively large city full of very imposing architectural monuments, churches, walls, everything that's suddenly deserted, and a city which existed in its prime before European cities, a city which was a major center of trade and culture, and yet a city which is completely deserted. Why is the city deserted? What does it mean? And it's in the middle of a mountainous, remote area. So it had a special resonance for travelers, but even more special for Armenians. And Armenians found it a symbol of their lost statehood. The Bagratuni dynasty, about which we'll talk in a minute, was one of the most important of the Armenian dynasties. And Armenians began, like in the Enlightenment when people in the West looked towards Greece and Rome, Armenians looked to their own antiquities to try to rediscover what it meant to be Armenian in the 19th century. And one of the places they went to was Ani. And so there were people, by the end of the 19th century, a lot of Armenian travelers started to go there. After the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 78, it was more accessible because it was under Russian Tsarist rule. So you could take a railroad to Alexandropol and go from there, or even there was a nearer stop that you could take on a railroad and go to Ani, and more people start to do that. And so many people start to do that, that by the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, there were a number of guidebooks or tour book type books that were written, and a lot of souvenirs, pictures, all kinds of things calling attention to it. And one of the people who visited Ani, though not specifically just as a tourist, was the author of our book, Gregorian Vartan Balakian. This is his statue post-mortem in France. That's him at a slightly older age than when he was traveling. And this is him when he actually visited Ani in 1909. And he went with the gentleman who is seated, who is Catholicos Matthäus II Ismirlian, who used to be called the Iron Patriarch because of what he did in the Hamidian period, and he was elected as Catholicos of all Armenians. And he went to St. Petersburg because you had to do that to be ratified in those days. And on his way back, even before he would come to his seat of Echmiadzin, he wanted to first stop in Ani because it was over 900 years that a Catholicos or Patriarch, Supreme Patriarch, had not stepped foot there and had a religious ceremony. So it was a very big thing. You can see that the guy all the way in the back with the verar, or the pointed black hat and beard. I mean, everyone has a beard and pointed black. The gentleman. Yeah. the gentleman with the ut letter here, this is actually Grigorius Balakian. So he was with a group of, I think, around 12 clergymen, and they had a very interesting long ceremony, and it's described in the book. But where did they go? The red dot is the site of Ani in today's map. You can see it's on the border of Turkey and Armenia. It's near Gyumri on one side, and in fact you can see the ruins of Armenia if you go to the edge of Armenia from Gyumri today, but you can't cross. And it's also near Kars as the biggest city on the other side. And this is a closer up map. But in ancient times, this was not just a crossroads, but it was actually the center of an Armenian kingdom, the Bagratic kingdom. You can see here that it actually includes, at one time includes all this area, but unfortunately, and Ani's right again here. But unfortunately, and here's another version, Ani and the other Bagratic territory splintered very quickly into sub-kingdoms because the NAASR system, the king would give his sons or his nephews and other relatives different territories, and unfortunately this was one of the reasons for its downfall. This is a artist's rendering of what Ani may have looked like at its peak in the 11th century. It's speculative, but you can see that it's encircled by ramparts. It's really a fortified city. It has a citadel in the middle, and it has what you call a Shahastan, or a territory that's where the people inside the city would live, and you'd have shops and things, and that's protected by walls. And then there's another set of walls. This is a drawing where you can see the layout of the city. It's sort of on a triangular spit, as they call it, on a plateau that's defined by two rivers, the Ahurian or Arpa Chai on the right, and the Alaja Chai, or which is the valley in Armenian. They call it Zalgad, no, it's sort of flower bed or flowery valley. So it's kind of defended on both sides by natural defenses of water. And in addition, when you add, there are a few places you'll see there are bridges. There used to be something like 14 or more bridges in different places, but you could only get through into the city through these bridges or through the north. And in the north, there are several sets of barriers that were walls that were built. One set here, and as the city grew larger, a second set here. This was built by King Ashod III, and this was built by King Simpat about 20 years or so afterwards. It's another version of the same thing. And in order to defend this area, they had also several fortified areas. This is, there's like one here, this is where the main citadel is, and then of course you saw all these walls. And I'm going to show you how difficult the terrain is. This is one of the remaining fragments of a bridge which went across the Ahurian, and this is one of the defensive points all the way on top. If you can see in the back, imagine how difficult it would be to take this, because you have this water here and then you have to climb up all the way there. You can see it from more of a distance, again, the Ahurian, and it's the same point in the back, same one. This is just an example of another church. You can see how well it was made. And this is the first rampart when the city was smaller. This was called Ashod, made by King Ashod. There are remnants of this only that are around. These are the larger double walled ramparts that King Simbat made in around, I guess, the late 980s. And these are supposed to be very advanced, more advanced in some ways than European ramparts. There's double walls, and the entryway to one is staggered, like from the first to the second. So if somebody gets in the first, they can be easily shot or attacked before they get into the second. And the height is very high. It goes up to something like 8 to 12, as high as 12 meters for the towers. And inside the towers, some of them contain churches, some of them they're inside internal passages, so you could go safely from one to another. There are places you could shoot arrows from. The stones that are used are have these kinds of designs. This is one of the gates. It was both beautiful, inspiring. A lot of them had crosses on it. It made a religious statement. And it was also defensively imposing. So this is actually an interesting, the lower part here are cave dwellings underneath the city. Part of Ani actually has a subterranean section, which is very extensive, that people lived in, and above that you could see again defensive fortifications. This is the citadel all the way on the top. And of course, in the ruins of Ani, Gregor Balakian takes you through first the history of Ani, and then he takes you to the topography of Ani, and then he goes through the different monuments and he gives a little bit of history and information about each one. This is the Cathedral of Ani, which is one of the major works, which was created by the architect Vartan, who also is famous for going to repair Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. So it is considered by many to incorporate some elements which are akin to Gothic architecture. Some people have theorized even that Armenian architecture contributed to the development of Gothic architecture. That's something that is in discussion, but there are different opinions about it. But the point is that it's very refined for this period of time, and new structural solutions were found that hadn't been used before. And Vartan was very famous. And this is another church that he made that didn't survive. It's no longer standing. This is the church of Gagik-Ashen, built by King Gagik, which is based on the model of Zvartnots, which is an earlier church which also no longer exists. It's in Armenia today. You can see it. It's sort of built on this model. This is a reconstruction of what Gagik-Ashen, St. Gregory Church would have looked like. This is another famous church which still has survived from 1215 or so. All these churches underwent changes in later periods. This is the church of Tigran Honens, who was a well-known merchant, and this symbolizes the power of the merchants. And Ani had become an urban center for trade. It was, I hate to always talk about silk trade, it's too in, but Ani really was on a lot of these international trade routes and benefited from it, so that even when Ani lost its independence, there were wealthy merchants who were able to sort of take over the lead and take over the place of the NAASR families, who are martial feudal families in the past, and they kind of evolved into something else. And you can see this has frescoes. This is a very dramatic church which was split into half, and you can see some of the pieces that a recent excavation was trying to put together. So Gregor Balakian tries to give you a picture as it was in the early 1900s of what to expect, how to go there, where it is, and the importance of these things. And he does it in a very emotional way. He's very tied to his Armenian past, and he, you can feel the emotion. And I think Peter and I first I toned it down a little, and perhaps Peter even did some more work on that, so it comes across sort of in terms that are approachable for contemporary readers. But for early 20th century Armenian reader, this was designed to really pull out your heartstrings as an Armenian and connect you with your past, to kind of make you aware of the glories of the ancient time, and make you feel like there's something that Armenians had been able to do, even if they are divided now between three different empires, between the Ottoman, the Persian, and the Russian. At one time, they themselves were masters of their fate, and they were creative people. And there aren't that many images of the kings from this period, so this is a imaginative reconstruction in Gyumri or Alexandropol today of Ashot III, the Merciful. He was called merciful because he gave a lot of money to churches and built things. He was actually not very merciful to his enemies. He liked decapitating or blinding and stuff like that, but he was very successful. But there are some very unique ones that have survived, and these are actually his two of his three sons, Sambat and Gurken Bagratuni, who are holding up a model of a church. And what's interesting is now these are the two sons later when the guy on the right, Sambat, has become a king. So he's wearing the turban, and so they're interesting. That's a close-up. And as it happened, there was a life-size, or maybe larger than life-size, model of King Gagik I that had fallen off of. It was the church that he had sponsored, Gagik Ashen, that I had mentioned to you before. And it was oftentimes architects would have a little sculpture of a donor and sometimes names and things on the wall. In this case, this is a freestanding sculpture, which is very unusual. And this is the Catholicos who is standing next to it during his visit, and he wanted specifically to be photographed with it. It's very rare to see this. This is a modern model of it in Armenia. But the Bagratuni dynasty really had a tragic end, as much of Armenian history. As I mentioned, on the one hand, the kingdom itself splintered. Ani was head of the kingdom, was from about 961 until 1045 only. So it's a very short period of time. It faced not only, what happened is that after the Arab invasion of Armenia, when the big powers around Armenia grew weak, Armenians were able to take advantage of that and fight to regain their independence. And the Bagratuni dynasty suffered less than the other dynasties. It kind of actually went along with the Arabs more, so it suffered less, and it was able to take advantage of the weakening of Arab power to eventually fight and gain independence to a degree. That lasted for maybe 150 years or so, but conditions changed as the Byzantine Empire started to regain territory and move back to the east. Also, the various Muslim powers in the area were still always restless and had started to have, for the last couple of hundred years, inhabitations or small principalities within traditional Armenian territory, and they were hostile generally to the Armenians. But ultimately, what happened is that the splintering of the Bagratunis, and eventually there was also another kingdom, the Ardzuruni kingdom in Van Vaspuragan, that was formed, that also splintered. This didn't allow the Armenians to work while they were fighting each other, as the Byzantines basically picked one off from the other, while Seljuk Turks started to come into the area too from the east, starting in the end of the 10th century, 11th century. So what happened is that the Byzantine emperors, also of Armenian background incidentally, forced one by one the various Armenian heads of principalities to give over their territories when they died. And the same thing happened with Ani. In Ani's case, first the king Hovsepian Sambat III decided to sign over in his will an agreement in order to avoid an attack by the Byzantines, that he would, when he died, he would hand over Ani to the Byzantine Empire. The rest of his court and other people were very upset about this, but there was nothing much they could do. This is a manuscript which actually is not in great shape, but you can, supposedly the guy standing here is paying obeisance to the this is the Byzantine emperor, Basil II, and this is the Armenian king, and so he's signing over supposedly his rights to Ani. Now, yes, yeah, this image is also from the same manuscript, and this is the last king of Armenia. I'm going to go really quickly. This is Gagik II, and he was tricked into going to Constantinople. The religious leader at the time, Catholicos Bedros Kedatarts, convinced him to do this. There were two parties in Ani. One wanted to fight till the bitter end. The other said it's better to go ahead and give our territories to the Byzantines. They'll protect us. So he initially was aligned with the fighting party, but he was, long story, but he was convinced to go to Constantinople to try to reach an agreement. But when he went there, he was put into prison in Marmara Island, and he wasn't allowed to go until he signed off on giving Ani. And then the populace tried to fight against us. This is the tomb of Vartan Pahlavi, who was one of the leaders he was a military leader. But the long and short of it is the Armenians had no chance, and so Ani lost its independence to the Byzantines in 1045, and then a very short period later the Seljuk Turks came, and the Byzantines weren't dedicated to fighting off attacks the way native Armenian troops were, and so the Seljuks took Ani. Although the Armenians tried to resist themselves, they were not able to do so, and that was the end of Ani. But it wasn't the end of Ani forever, because Ani continued, as I said, to be a commercial center. It lost its independence, but under various first Kurdish and Turkic rulers, and then Mongols, and all kinds of different dynasties for the next couple of years, it produced all kinds of works of art. This was in the exhibit, if any of you went to the Metropolitan exhibit. This is a book stand from Ani. This is a manuscript. And even coins were minted in Ani, silver coins, as late as the 1300s and 1400s. So I'm going to basically stop here. This is just, I want to point out something which Peter may deal with more, that today, those initial investigations into Ani at the end of the 19th century, Nicholas Marr, Orbelli, and others, they investigated from 1890s till about 1917. Ani was lost to the Russian Empire, became part of the Republic of Turkey, and so it was very hard to do any excavations. A museum that was set up was destroyed for the most part, and no attention was really paid to it until modern times, relatively recently. And very, very recently, some attempts, because of the complaints of destruction of Ani, attempts were made at renovations, but you can see this is an example where they took off the cross above the line and they distorted the line, and so a lot of problems. And I'm going to leave you with these two last images. This is last couple of years, a Turkish radical nationalist party holding a religious service in what they call the Fethiye, or the Conquest Mosque. That's what they renamed the cathedral. And then a year or two later, an Azerbaijani fashion show was held in the Cathedral Ani for Turkish El. So we can discuss that. I'm sure Peter will talk more about it. But it's a very important topic for us both historically as a center, and it also has many reverberations, which I'm sure we'll talk about soon. Thank you.
So I was saying that, being here in the new digs is really spectacular, and I think back to being here 35 years ago, and that was great too, but it's a marvelous evolution. And Aram and Takayan Cultural Association, thank you. Aram, thank you for all you've done for this book and for all you've done for so many fronts over the years. And our work together keeps evolving, and I hope it keeps going. The Ruins of Ani is making its little splash. It had a big, sizably, a significant review in the TLS last month. So the little book is getting out there, and I think it can really create conversation. And I'd like us to have conversation about any aspect of Ani, of course, historically, but also I hope we can talk a bit about how Ani might be a bridge for Turkish-Armenian truth and reconciliation. So what I want to do in the 20 minutes I just held Aram to so we can have conversation. I want to give you a flavor for some of the voice of the ruins of Ani, the first book of my great uncle's 7 or 8 books, only 3 of which exist. I want to give you a little feeling for the sense of discovery, the excitement of his going there in 1909 with the patriarchal retinue, with the patriarch and the clergymen that Aram showed you in the photograph, which comes from the original photos of this book, of that moment when Nicholas Marr and his group had excavated Ani and turned Ani into a kind of growing world site, a kind of heritage site, even that early. This is in the 1894 to 1917 period, before Ani would disappear behind the post-World War I treaties and Turkish repression. And then what I'd like to do is say something about the significance of cultural destruction as a component of genocide, and then read a piece. This is all from my introduction to the book. Read a piece just straight up, because it's the best way I can deliver what I want to deliver. Read a few pages of reflection about the present and the post-genocide legacy. So here, from my great uncle's, he was a Vartan at the time, and he was a bishop at the time of his death, a bishop of the Armenian Church of South France. At a certain moment near the end of this travel memoir history, Balakian confesses, quote, "I was overjoyed at this opportunity to see Ani. I had a thirst to see those eternal monuments of the past glory of our forefathers. I wanted to kiss that holy soil." Balakian's affect is certainly not ambiguous. For the Armenian imaginary, Ani embodies a historical truth. The ruined medieval city was once a great capital of eternal monuments, a center of Armenian civilization, a topography and a landscape that was a sacred geography. I'm going to read just a few passages along the way. Yes, as Aram noted, he's excited, he's passionate. This is evidence that this city was the equivalent, say, of Armenia's Florence. This was Armenia's Florence, and he's discovered it. And here is Balakian again, kind of singing the praises, comparing Ani to European monuments. Make of it what you will. While Lynch, you know, who wrote the 2-volume travel opus in the late 19th century, H.F.B. Lynch. While Lynch ascribes the origin of Gothic architecture to the East, another scholar, the Frenchman Texier, goes a step further with a definite assertion that the Gothic style has an Armenian origin. Okay, this is Balakian's claim, and maybe not his only. And that the architectural chef d'oeuvre style Gothic had come to Central Europe by means of emigration from the Arpachai, another name for Ani, and the river on which it is. Thus, when the first invasions of Ani by Arslan began in 1064, some of the population began to migrate in groups to Poland and Moldavia and Central Europe, and they brought with them, among other things, their arts and crafts. Thus, the Armenians of Ani created a foundation in medieval Central Europe for the incomparable Gothic style, which in its forms and variety of beautiful carving and stonework was the chef d'oeuvre of all architectural styles. I would note among those monumental achievements Venice's San Marco Basilica, Milan's Cathedral, Paris's Notre Dame, and London's Westminster Abbey. All right, you get it, right? These are large claims, they're his claims. And of course, again, there is Turdat's masterpiece. These are from, again, my great uncle's own photographs from 1909, 1910. He went to Europe to have them made. In his first chapter, he writes about the care he took to create these images then. Now, if you compare these images with what you see at Ani today, it's a very instructive barometer for how much has been destroyed or let to erode. Okay, is it the origin of European Gothic? You decide. I know we can get a lot of art historians involved in that, but you know, you can see the difference 111 years ago. Okay, well, we're coming into, you know, what Aram just showed you too, today's Ani and the walls. But a palace just doesn't look like that today. And there is the Gagik Catholicos moment. I'm sorry, the head's cut off. I'm going to bring you through a few of these quickly. I'm certainly not going to lecture on them. Okay. Balakian has a lot to say about the stone, the carving, the artistry. He's really in love with the sensuality and the beauty of the decorative work and the refinement of Armenian artisan work and craft. A lot to say about that, but not here now, and you can find it in the book. I do want to note this, you know, that when we think about all the destruction in the wake of Ottoman Turkish decimation of the Armenian population and the material culture, I want to always underscore, and Raphael Lemkin, the definer, originator of the concept of genocide as a crime in international law, Lemkin was very fixated on the destruction of culture as a primary component of genocide. It did not get into Article 2 of the UN 1948 Charter. He couldn't, you know, he had a horse trade to make Article 2 happen. But if he had his way, it would have been an important part of his understanding. You don't only kill people, but you destroy their culture and their identity in relation to that culture. So cultural property, the cultural producers, intellectuals and artists, belief value systems, historical territory, all fall under the rubric. I've written about this in some, you know, in some articles in some depth, but again, not for tonight. But I want to note that because it does figure into how we navigate our own sense as a community, if I can say that, we, whatever that might mean, but Armenians as a community, Armenian diasporans, Armenian North Americans, Armenians in the Republic, might navigate their sense of the significance of Ani today. The legacy of cultural destruction in any genocidal history plays out in complicated ways. Armenian aftermath is inseparable from the predicament of both exile and exclusion from the historical past. Many of the ruins of Armenian monuments and buildings, sacred and secular, have been demolished, appropriated, eroded by negligence and assault since 1915. The landscape of Turkey is covered with ruins of Armenian churches, among other architectural monuments, and even the remains are subject to continued erosion and removal throughout Turkey over the past decades. You know, I go on here to talk about Turkish denial, and it's a subject everybody in this room has thought about and is familiar with. But I I want to push it to another place. Although Armenian tourists can view well, let me put it this way. Most of historic Armenia inside of Turkey is walled off to Armenians, both inside and outside of Turkey. The 30,000 Armenians living in Turkey today have access to the Patriarchate and several other churches in Istanbul, but the rest of Turkey is for them no different than for the Armenians in the Republic and the diaspora. In fact, that's probably not accurate, because I think they are much more walled off from Eastern Turkey than we are as diasporans who have the privilege of our other citizenships to travel there, although this is not the best time to do that, but it has been a place to travel, I'm sure for many in this room over the past couple of decades. Armenian tourists can view some of these sites for brief moments on tourist-controlled visits. They can do so only in a context defined by police surveillance and a state tourist industry that mislabels the ruins and structures in order to deny Armenian historic identity, and the ruins come to haunt Armenian communities in ongoing ways. Inside the Turkish state, Armenian ruins are taboo and represent a forbidden past, an irreclaimable history, a paradox of an embodied absence, one in which loss and the widening exilic gap amplify each other. Looking on from the Armenian-Turkish border at the ruins of Ani into a zone that is closed by Turkey with barbed wire and military guards adds another dimension to the aftermath of what I call the Armenian lockout predicament. The sense of loss grows within a strange dialectic of witnessing continual ruin. So let me push forward to some images here. How many people in the room have been to Ani? Okay, yeah, well, I'm glad. The drama there is quite extraordinary, even without all the other emotional and ethical overlays. This is from, I think this is from one of my trips in 14 or 15. I've been there a few times. And Aram showed you similar images. We're at the Armenian-Turkish border there, looking across to Armenia. There's that bridge, emblematic, a trope itself, isn't it? The broken connection. I want to get to the signage. Okay, so, you know, if we talk about the current situation, the blue signage of the end of the 20th century, I'm not sure when it went up, had no mention of anything even remotely evocative of an Armenian past. And then around 2003 or 4, different signage went up. And here too, there is no mention of the word Armenia or Armenian, but a couple of Armenian figures appeared. Pakratuni, Turdat, you know, who knows what Turkish tourists or any other tourists who aren't Armenian would make of these signs. I mean, of those words. They mean nothing, Pakratuni or Turdat, but those words appeared. But the history narrated here is an erasure of the actual history and founding of the place. Some of these newer signs had been mauled. I don't know, you know, who knows? Who knows the context for it? Big difference between that image of from my uncle's 1909 image compared with this. Well, there I am. Now, for example, they're going to call it the Dikran Honen's Church, but nobody would know what that means. You know, so there's a sense of disembodiment here that's quite powerful when one knows the history. And that is some of the restoration that was done on the roof area of that church. And those of you who've been there know what a dramatic interior that place is. I think I have some images of inside. The frescoes are still there. Well, you know, still, you know, the remains of frescoes are there. And there is Armenian writing. That is Rachel Gregorian, who was my guide on my first, my first trip, a marvelous scholar and historian of early Ottoman periods. And Rachel got me there in one piece and out as well in 2014. And Aram was showing you images of the Turkish Elle magazine fashion shoot, which gives you, again, we could do a semiotic session just on that. It's a good seminar because it's so unpackable what it means to put a fashion shoot in an erased city of a genocidal history in which the victims have been erased from their own monuments and even ruins. I don't know why these are cut off. Well, I'm cut off here, Joe. There's an effort to ordain me with light here, but I'm not sure it worked. All right, I'm now out of Ani. Oh yeah, there we're back at the fashion shoot. There was a lot. Those of you who remember this will remember the internet conversations that were going on globally. There was a lot of anger and outrage, and there was a lot of misunderstanding from the other side of the fence, even from Turks and Kurds who didn't fully understand what was going on but were sympathetic, and then there were the deniers. It's a very interesting moment to study, I feel. Am I going in the right? Yeah. And there, of course, I was told when I arrived there in late May of 2014 that that flag had only been up for 6 months. So a sense of nationalist, Turkish nationalist anxiety has led now to more and more appropriation and overlay of Turkish identity on this place that Bishop Balakian described as the Florence of, if that's a useful term, of Armenia. Okay, let's go. Well, I think this is a nice place. Let me read just the last couple pages here and turn it over. You know, to say briefly, before this terrible deep state kind of reign of terror that Erdogan has, instituted in Turkey, there had been a decade of work on Ani, global and international work. UNESCO got involved, World Monuments Fund got involved, scholars and architects and restorationists were coming from Europe and North America. There was something happening, and that's been shut down for the moment, and yet some steps were in progress. Ani is today a popular tourist site for anyone traveling to the region, but its revenues belong to Turkey. If Ani were a shared space with a shared tourist revenue and shared restoration priorities, might the lost city not become an example to the world about how cultural heritage can play an ethical role in conflict resolution? If Turkey were able to acknowledge the Armenian historical past at Ani, it might lessen the Turkish state's paranoia about the Armenian past in Anatolia. Such recognition would be an organic gesture forward. one that would help both Turkey and Armenia. Ani offers the possibility of becoming a mutually beneficial, co-directed historical site, but a place of meeting where truth must precede reconciliation. The banishment of the word Armenia at Ani continues to create a sense of the absurd, and this serves both Turkey and Armenia badly. The call for a continued and robust restoration project at Ani is concrete and offers an unusual geopolitical opportunity. Notwithstanding Turkey's current tenor of state repression and extreme nationalism, there will be a future with new directions, and Ani can embody one of them. It would seem that the remains of this major historic site will not wait much longer for its truth. Thank you.
I should mention that we have an event upcoming in about a month that is organically connected to tonight's event, and that is a lecture on March 25th here by Professor Christina Moranci from Tufts University on new discoveries at Ani Cathedral. She has been doing work that she would like to be presenting for the first time almost anywhere, certainly in this area, to our audience in a month. So mark your calendars for that, and certainly a different side of Ani than we've been able to hear about tonight. But I would like to now open the floor to questions for our two great speakers. Sure. Judy.
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to ask you, who is doing the restoration work? Is it being done by specialists, or is it just being done haphazardly? Because there were things that you demonstrated where they were erasing certain imagery and putting on, sort of like metal roofs on opponents' church. So I wanted to know what was happening there. And
So
was it being
so
done?
there were some really progressive Turks, especially Oskan Yavuz. Did you know him?
I know who he is.
Yeah, Oskan Yavuz was working, he's an architect and a restoration specialist who was working in conjunction with the Turkish tourist board, the historical commission, and he was really working with Ankara. So Ankara was involved. World Monuments Fund, UNESCO. I know Christina Moranci was on a team that was making regular visits. So there were historians, there were scholars, there were architects, restorationists. Yeah, it was really serious. I mean, but it was under the tight fist of the Turkish state. So it depended on how people were feeling in Ankara about these issues. Now it's a horror show, I mean, as you know, Osman Kavala is in prison for an indefinite time, and he was a key player in this. And I mean, just to answer you in a personal way, in October of 2016, Christina, myself, Osman, and Rachel met with the Turkish cultural emissary to the UN at the UN. I mean, so we were sitting at the UN in October of 2016 talking about the next phase of this, and with a serious sense that nomenclature might be the next thing to happen. And we know what happened. Everything went, into a reign of terror. So it was very serious. There were real people involved. It was promising, but that's always the complexity of history.
I actually would add that there were problems, though, with those restorations that did take place, that while there were some well-meaning people there, there were also, I think, people who were not, the teams who were working on the sites didn't always have the access to the proper information. And secondly, a lot of things were done in a rushed way. They destroyed materials, and a lot of people feel that they actually reconstructed things without first having a full plan. And secondly, they got rid of a lot of what they called rubble, which contained actual remnants or things that had fallen off of buildings. There were several feet worth of this material that accumulated over the past decades. And so there were a few people who were well-intentioned, but a lot of what has been done has been actually more destructive, to the extent that people say that it would have been better for them not to do anything at all than to do what they did. And even the stabilization that I showed in one or two of my pictures, there are some issues with that. So, and now, of course, it's a moot point, perhaps, but it's worrisome when, and I showed the image, they took away specifically Armenian Christian imagery, whether that was on purpose or it was just one of the flaws of the process, I don't know, but certainly, we have every reason to suspect this, considering what happened in Akhtamar and other places. So.
Yes.
So that area, Kars Ardahan, has a lot of Azerbaijani immigrants, and actually when you're driving around Kars, you see like Arafat restaurant, and you see a lot of you can tell they're Azerbaijanis, there are a lot. How much influence do they have for the signage and for being pillaged?
Repeat the question. Can you repeat?
Well, the question is, do Azeris who live in the Kars region have an influence on the local vandalism, and B, on state policy? I mean, Aram will give you his take on it. As for local vandalism, probably, I mean, if I were to guess, I'm sure vandalism is probably local. I think state policy really comes from Ankara, from the cultural board. That's how I understand it. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I kind of agree in general. I think that also that territory, that perhaps there's an influx of Azeri, not just partly because of economic reasons and natural reasons, but also I think it's a continuation of demographic policies to change the balance of that area and to make sure that it doesn't become more Kurdish. And I think that there's certainly more hostility towards Armenians because of events that took place in the Caucasus, compared to probably what the local Kurds and others who are and Turks who are living in that area in recent times. So, but it's ultimately not controlled by them, it's controlled by the state, and the state has specific policies which change depending on regime.
In the back, Bob?
Thank you kindly. So I have a vague recollection of a shared site setting list, shared cultural setting list that used to exist. Is there a list of churches like this that are on a list of being future shared?
Do you mean all over Turkey?
Right.
You mean
what
do you mean share?
You mean all existing Armenian church structures in Turkey?
Yeah, they're
Yeah. I think, for example, didn't the Hrant Dink Foundation publish a report a few years ago?
I mean, yes, there have been many such lists, starting from when the Armenian Patriarchate submitted things for the Treaty of Lausanne and afterwards. So there are plenty of lists. I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to. There are also lists of sites that are architecturally particularly endangered and worthy of assistance, and I think at least 3 or more are actually on the UNESCO list of urgent places that need work. And Turkey itself has applied for money for several of these sites, which is interesting. And approach has been, I think the United Nations has requested them to revise some of their approaches. I don't know what happened very recently on that.
So that would be the tribunal for processing the future safeguarding of these sites through the UN or something like that?
Not,
You mean in terms of possible compensation or return?
we're not there yet. If we're,
Protected sites. by
it's
UNESCO.
even for protection, yeah, I think,
Or, yes,
Your uncle, your great uncle went there in 1909.
Correct.
Was there, I don't know if that was before or after the Adela massacre, but was there a relationship in the going there or
no.
somewhere?
And, you know, I know in my excuse me, my introduction, I write about this. There's not a relationship other than a historical coincidence, so that they arrived at Ani in June of '09, and the massacres at Adanat happened in April, and it's almost dovetailing. In 1909, Ani was under Russian rule, so that this was only permissible. This event was only possible because this part of the Armenian highlands at this time belonged to the Russian Empire. So that's important to understand. That's why all this activity in progress could happen from the Nicholas Marr 1894 starting of excavations until the Bolshevik Revolution, you know, and then the collapse of Russia in World War I, and the loss of this territory in the wake of the genocide and the peace treaties that followed the war. So Ani has this little window, and that's when my uncle visits it, and he's exploding with excitement that this will be a key part of Armenia's recovery and renaissance. And such is, you know, the dialectic of history.
I'd add that actually there's a direct connection, and Balakian indirectly speaking to the 1909 massacres and the forward to this book, because he's talking about why Armenians are attacking each other and why they have disputes and divisions, and he's looking at what happened in the Bagratid period, which is we had seen was particularly full of dissension. It was one of the reasons of destruction of the last Armenian kingdom. But he also says that it is ironic because we are just starting to get out from under the despotism that has nearly destroyed us. As the new Turkish reforms attempt to ameliorate old conditions of tyranny, we seem to be heading down a road of national suicide and national dissolution. Let us hope that our own divisions, which have been so prevalent in the last 2 years, this is 1910, during this moment of transitional Ottoman constitutional reform, will soon end, so we can create a new invigorating era and seek peaceful progress in education and our economy. This is the only path for our salvation. He's basically saying here that, compared to what some of the other political parties are saying, he's saying that the way to do it is through peaceful, at this point, is through peaceful education and working within the system and working together as Armenians. And he's referring directly to the, which one? Ani massacres. So, Adana massacres.
Yes, over there.
You mentioned that they're doing some renovation of construction. How about the murals? Are they working on those also or not?
Murals. Well, come back in a month and you'll hear more about the murals specifically. I don't want to give away any secrets.
There's something interesting.
Just say yes or no.
Yes, sir.
Hi, yeah, great presentation. I have a two-part question. So in that post-kingdom period, right, that we talked about, where the merchant class was still operating, A, did they keep up the churches and the Armenian cultural buildings and everything? And B, did they have a relationship with Jirair, you know, the old Jirair further east?
Yes, and he asked whether in the period after the dissolution of or the fall of the Armenian Bagrationi kingdom, whether the merchant class kept operating and did it support churches, and secondly, whether in a did have trade relationships with Armenians in Julfa or Jura, and it is what kept Ani going was that it was a trade center. So this was a period of transition, in medieval economy for Armenia, and it wasn't just Ani. There were other centers that were already benefiting from this international trade, and it was leading to more urban forms of life. And it was very different. It's atypical. Armenians traditionally had not been city dwellers. When Armenians had cities in the earlier, like Hellenistic period, there would be people who were Greeks or Jews or Syriacs or other people who were brought in, not actual ethnic Armenians who were used to living in the mountains or villages. So things had changed, and they supported churches. That Tigran Honen's church was a wealthy merchant who helped fund a church, and they were very involved. And they also had trade networks, and Ani was in the center of many of those networks. And one of the reasons why many people from the Crimea to the Balkans to Poland to around the world, say we're connected to Ani is because their ancestors probably traded through those networks, and that helped them find the way out when Ani fell. Ani continued until probably the wars between the Safavids and the Ottomans in the to the end of early 1600s. Until then, Ani was still involved in trade. That was probably the final blow. By the end of the 1600s, it was a very insignificant village. By the next century, it was barely there.
If I could mention one thing, again, there's a book. It's for sale. We encourage you to purchase it. It's a way of showing your support for our authors, and by the way, to get a very interesting book to read. And I'd like to call on the young man who I've been trying to call on there twice and keep missing. So please, I know there's a lot of questions, but I want to take one more, and then I want to give everybody the opportunity to purchase the book and have it signed. Yes, sir.
I think I've read that the border from Armenia to Ani is now accessible, or somehow you can cross over. Do you know what the status of that border is?
It's not accessible, no. You can't do it. It's part of what I'm calling the lockout predicament. It's really a lockout.
You can approach Ani and see Ani from the Armenian side, but you can't actually go over to the other side.
Can you access to Georgia?
Well,
yeah,
I mean,
you could go up to Georgia and come down to
very
Turkey.
long way, but it would take you half an hour if it was accessible.
Yes, you can get there, but not directly. Right. So, once again, I'd ask you to please thank our speakers and authors. And we thank you for being here, so please show your support.